Good morning, friends of North Shore Community College. It is a beautiful day, perfect temperature. We welcome you to our college. My name is Dr. Sheldon Brown. I serve as chairperson of the Tolerance Committee on Forums. We thank you for attending our 28th Forum on Tolerance, Weaving Autism into Our Social Fabric. One of my psychology students who achieved an A has Asperger's syndrome. He graduated from North Shore in 2010 with a GPA near 4.0. He's now attending Endicott College, and I'm so proud of him. Also, you may have seen in a recent news report about how an iPod is being used to teach communication to persons with autism. What a great discovery. Last week, we showed our students an inspirational HBO DVD about the life and important discoveries of Dr. Temple Grandin. She was featured on a recent TV episode of Extreme Makeover. In your folder, you will find a purple sheet of a review of the Temple DVD. Temple Grandin walked through many doors to achieve successes. Today, we too shall walk through a door leading to understand autism. One of my former students gave me this piece appropriate for the forum called The Beauty of Holland. The Beauty of Holland. I am often asked to describe the experience of raising a child with a disability, to try to help people who have not shared that unique experience to understand it, to imagine how it would feel. It's like this. When you're going to have a baby, it's like planning a fabulous vacation trip to Italy. You buy a bunch of guidebooks and make your wonderful vacation plans. The Colosseum, Michelangelo's David, the gondolas in Venice. You may learn some handy phrases in Italian. It's all very, very exciting. After months of eager anticipation, the day finally arrives. You pack your bags and off you go. Several hours later, the plane lands. The flight attendant comes in and says, "Welcome to Holland." Holland, you say. What do you mean, Holland? I signed up for Italy. I'm supposed to be in Italy. All my life I've dreamed of going to Italy. But there's been a change in the flight plan. They landed in Holland, and there you must stay. The important thing is that they haven't taken you to a horrible, disgusting, filthy place full of pestilence, famine, and disease. It's just a different place. So you must go out and buy new guidebooks, and you must learn a whole new language, and you will meet a whole new group of people you would have never met. It's just a different place. It's slower paced than Italy, less flashy than Italy. But after you've been there for a while and you catch your breath, you look around and you begin to notice that Holland has windmills. Holland has tulips. Holland even has Rembrandts. But everyone you know is busy coming and going from Italy. They're all bragging about what a wonderful time they had there. And for the rest of your life, you will say, yes, that's where I was supposed to go. That's what I had planned. And the pain of that will never, ever, ever go away, because the loss of that dream is a very significant loss. But if you spend your life mourning the fact that you didn't get to Italy, you may never be free to enjoy the very special, the very lovely things about Holland. Now, it's my honor to introduce the academic leader of North Shore Community College, Paul Frederick. Paul Frederick is Vice President of North Shore. He has always supported the work of our Tolerance Committee since we began the Forum Series in 1994. Paul has introduced all previous 27 forums, which are listed in the blue brochure in your folder. Our committee is grateful to Paul for helping to make the forum a signature event at the college. We express our deep appreciation to Academic Vice President Paul Frederick.
Thank you very much, Ellen, and good morning to everyone. Today I have the pleasure of introducing the chairwoman of this year's Forum on Tolerance, North Shore Community College student, Nicole Levy. Nicole learned about the Forum on Tolerance Committee in 2009 by writing an article about Dr. Brown, the Jewish advocate. She met NSCC President Dr. Wayne Burton at the 25th Forum that year and learned that he also had a passion for advocating for individuals with autism. Dr. Brown and his committee agreed to host a program about autism with Nicole as his leader, with Pat LaVoy assisting. Like many caring for a child with autism, learning how to help her daughter led Nicole. It began by trying to make sense of symptoms at a time when she was learning to be a mother. Pursuing services for her daughter through the medical and special education system became akin to being dropped into a foreign country, language, or culture. Fortunately, she found support through professionals and from parents who had gone through similar experiences. However, she feels that the general public needs to demonstrate their support for individuals and families affected by autism in order for its population to be accepted. For Nicole, this conference serves as a milestone on her journey. It is with a great deal of pleasure that I bring to the podium North Shore Community College student Nicole Levy. Nicole?
First of all, I would like to thank the college for embracing this project. Additionally, I would like to thank the participants in this forum. They've truly helped shape this whole morning. I would also like to offer appreciation to Lint and Sprungly USA, who have generously donated 18 cases of chocolate to this morning's program. Across America each weekday, there are few sights more common than seeing children go to school. However, for parents with children with autism, their pursuit of services can often be anything but standard. They can frequently feel frustrated by the limited resources for providing necessary services. And this situation often pits them against very well-meaning people, such as school district personnel and insurance companies. This situation needs to be improved. And this also gives a negative effect towards the students involved. In 2007, Ellen Chambers, the director of SpedWatch, wrote that 90% of high school students with disabilities, including high-functioning autism and Asperger's syndrome, do not have cognitive impairments that would prevent them from learning. Yet, only 63% of them graduate from high school within 4 years. This is in comparison to 82% of the general population. You've probably heard of the term hockey mom. You've probably heard of a soccer mom as well. And recently, we've heard of tiger mom. Well, I've got a new one for you. It's called Autism Mom. Autism Mom is a combination of a hockey mom, a soccer mom, and a tiger mom. Why I say this is because autism moms and dads will drive miles and miles to provide services for their children. They will pursue supports like a hockey player driving the puck down the ice. Like Tiger Mom, they hold high expectations for their children. But autism moms and dads can't do it alone. And all the participants in this panel and in this speaker series, in addition to the people at the resource tables, all understand this. And that's why I call them my weavers, hence the name of our forum, Weaving Autism into Our Social Fabric. They, through their professional work, break the boundaries that prevent students from being included, students with autism being included in society. But you, the audience, I want you to become apprentice weavers by the end of this morning. Together, we will be able to weave a fabric that is strong enough to repel prejudice and bullying, yet supple enough to incorporate the potential achievements of individuals with autism. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Karen Levine. Karen Levine is the co-author of the book Replays, in which she demonstrates methods that for children with emotional dysregulation to help them work in regular situations. She is a co-founder of the former autism clinic at Children's Hospital in Boston. She also is the founder of the Building Blocks program at Northeast Arc, which provides community-based services for toddlers with autism. She has been a great help in putting together this project, giving advice and offering her knowledge to me. Dr. Levine has a private practice in Lexington. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. I love the autism tiger hockey mom phrase. I think it's so true. It's a real honor to be speaking here today, and I really appreciate being invited to be part of this forum. And Nicole's right, I did give a lot of advice, and she was probably a little tired of my advice at this point. So, but it's been fun trying to pull it together. What I'm going to do is give. Some of you have been living and breathing autism most of your lives, and some of you are probably fairly new to the topic. So I'm going to give somewhat of a background overview, probably a little bit of the more boring part of the morning, but I'll show some video clips that should be interesting to perk it up a little bit. But I just thought we could make sure we're kind of all on the same page in terms of what we're talking about with autism, because it's some of these terms can be very confusing. Okay, what ASD, autism spectrum disorders, is a common term these days to describe the whole spectrum of Asperger's, autism, PDD. And the term autism sometimes also used to describe the whole spectrum too. PDD, NOS is sometimes used. And then Asperger's we'll talk much more about as well. There are two other terms that are in the autism category: Rett syndrome, which is a genetic disorder, and then childhood disintegrative disorder, which is when kids develop typically until 4 or 5 and then dramatically lose most of their areas of functioning, which is much more rare than autism. Okay, what is autism spectrum disorder? people with autism spectrum disorders have different or limited abilities in these domains. So in communication skills, verbal and nonverbal skills, and difficulty with the chit-chat of conversation. So this ranges from people who have no language at all, maybe no communication system, to people who maybe have some gestures or some signs or maybe use pictures. Or, as you mentioned, the iPad is becoming increasingly helpful in terms of augmentative communication and other voice output devices. Or people at the milder end of the spectrum with Asperger's might have a wonderful language but have trouble with the conversational use of language. They might have an enormous vocabulary. Some of my 5 and 6 and 7-year-old patients have vocabularies, use words that I don't even know what they mean, but have trouble with just the back and forth, how you doing kind of conversation. So that difficulty cuts across the spectrum. Social functioning, difficulties with social functioning is really the primary area of difficulty, again, across the spectrum. Difficulty with perspective taking, what's called theory of mind, so figuring out what you're thinking about what I'm thinking. And perspective taking, it turns out, impacts almost everything we do. I mean, if all of you are looking up and putting your hands behind your ears, I would know that you're thinking that I'm not talking loudly enough, and I would raise my volume. So just those little kinds of things, perspective taking, impact all different aspects of interaction, conversation. Difficulty intuitively knowing the social rules and norms, knowing if you bump into someone by accident, you say, oops, sorry, that kind of thing. If someone drops something, you might help them pick it up. Just things that little kids pick up naturally. Kids on the spectrum generally have to be taught or have to learn that in a very deliberate way, whereas they might be able to learn all the names of dinosaurs or the planets or factual information, or learning to read even very early on without ever having to be taught. So it's almost the flip. What comes very naturally to typically developing kids and has to be taught, whereas what often has to be taught may come very naturally for kids on the spectrum. Difficulty with the social niceties. One of my patients, I said something like, where are you going on vacation? He said, Florida, of course. And I said, well, I didn't know you were going to Florida. And he had assumed that I had assumed that I would know, since I knew him, that he was going to Florida. So he was a little irritated with me that I didn't know that. Another patient I hadn't seen for about a year, I said, oh, how are you? It's been so long. And he said, fine. And he was actually very fond of me. And he didn't say, how are you? That sort of saying back kind of thing, which would be easy to interpret as rudeness or a lack of caring, but it's not that at all. It's just not knowing that you're supposed to respond in those kinds of ways. And then the third category that again cuts across functioning levels is this interest orientation, a narrow range of interest. So people with Asperger's often have a few areas that they may know everything about, and there are many people like Temple Grandin, for instance, who are very, very successful within their own narrow field, but may know little about other things. Actually, that reminds me of myself in some ways, except for a little common sense, but I know a lot about psychology. But it's the things that people with Asperger's tend to be very, very expert at, tend to be things that are factually related. But many scientists, many successful scientists, for instance, may have Asperger's. But people who are more cognitively impacted also may have very specific areas that become their favorite perseverative focus of interest. If someone is very successful in their field, we call it a passion. If someone is not successful, we call it a perseveration, but it's two sides of the same coin. Okay, as I mentioned before, autism spectrum disorders describes people within a huge range of abilities and disabilities. And if technology is with us today, hope you all got your power back, by the way. I'm going to show this little boy. This is a little clip from YouTube, and he's pretty impaired, impacted in terms of communication, interaction, just to give an example.
Devontae, say hi, Mom. Hey, you're just whistling. Can you tell Mom bye? Did you find the ball, baby? Come on, Devontae. No.
So he's pretty impacted by autism, and it's very heartbreaking. You can hear his mom calling him, say, "Hi, Mom," and he doesn't turn to her. He's whistling and doing his thing. He looks very content, but he's not connecting back to her. Most kids with autism spectrum disorders, wherever they are on the spectrum, are very attached to their parents and their caregivers and people who are close to them, but they may show it in different ways. They may not know to turn their head when you call their name. But most parents do feel a strong attachment from the kids, and most kids are very attached. It's not a disorder of attachment, it's a disorder of interaction and communication. But it can feel that way. It can feel like they don't care because they don't respond necessarily in the same ways. Okay, how common is Asperger's? You see different numbers thrown around in the media, and one reason they're different numbers is it depends exactly how you measure it, who's counting, how they're counting. But about 1 in 110 is how common is the number that people are using these days, which is much more common than it used to be. And we don't really know. There are different explanations why that is. Are people counting differently? Are the numbers really going up? Are people including more? And it may be a bit of both. Asperger's specifically, there aren't exact numbers. And a lot of that is because of diagnosing variability. Sometimes it depends. We used to have a joke when I worked at children. Your diagnosis would depend what floor you got off on in the elevators. But there's certainly regional differences in terms of how people diagnose. But some studies suggest it's 1 in 3,000, so about 20% of people in the autism spectrum have Asperger's. And again, we don't know exactly. And about 3/4 of those are males. And as I was alluding to, there's diagnostic confusion in the field. And different terms are also used. Asperger's, high-functioning autism, high-functioning PDD, nonverbal learning disability, autism spectrum disorder. Sometimes they're used quite specifically to mean specific things. Sometimes they're used generally to describe the whole spectrum. It's obviously more important to know the individual and what their individual strengths and needs are and what could be most helpful to them than it is the term. And the terms are also going to be changing very soon with the new diagnostic manual coming out in 2012. And they're probably going to be subsumed under autism spectrum disorder, so we won't have this kind of extreme confusion in terms of terminology. But in general, people with Asperger's have at least average intelligence. Many are very, very bright. And oftentimes, most people with Asperger's want to be social but aren't very good at it, which puts them in a very difficult position. It's very different from not wanting to be social. You see everybody else there knowing what to do and how to do it, and you want to do it too, and it's very hard for you to break in. So it's hard for kids, and it's hard for adults. People with autism are much more impacted socially and generally cognitively too, like the first boy we saw. And then PDD-NOS is used basically for in-between in general. This just shows the breakdown across the spectrum. And again, Asperger's is about 20% within that whole spectrum. Okay, who makes the diagnosis and how? It's generally made by psychologists, psychiatrists, neurologists, or doctors, pediatricians, or internists. If you're having somebody diagnosed or if you're seeking a diagnosis yourself, you really want to go to someone who specializes in autism or Asperger's. You want to go to someone who specializes in autism or Asperger's within the age range of the person being assessed. Because it can be confusing. Someone can have social difficulties for all different kinds of reasons. They might be shy and anxious and obsessive. They might have language problems. So you really want someone who's very experienced within autism or Asperger's to see if that's what the issue is. There isn't any specific medical test. There isn't any specific genetic marker. And there's lots of funding going to try and figure this out. And a lot of people these days, kids who get diagnosed are often asked to participate in research studies looking for any kind of genetic markers or metabolic markers or any kind of other issues. And periodically you'll see a news report that they've discovered the gene for autism or discovered a certain mechanism for autism, and then it turns out, so far it's turned out, that describes a few kids with autism, but when the study's replicated, it doesn't apply to all the kids. Probably autism and Asperger's are what we call the final common pathway, so there are probably a lot of different things that can cause autism. it's probably the autisms. So it may look the same. The two kids or two adults might have the same sort of functioning, but it may come from very different sources. So probably over time we'll discover that there are different causes of autism. In terms of agreement about diagnosis, I've talked a little about how there's such confusion in the field, but there's a large percentage of people who everybody would agree meet the criteria for autism or meet the criteria for Asperger's. There's some people who are kind of have some characteristics and not others who people would disagree about, but there are a lot of most people given the diagnosis, most people would agree meet the criteria. The diagnosis can change over time. Sometimes kids, when they're 2 and 3, in the programs through the Northeast Arc, the Building Blocks program, sometimes people are diagnosed at 2 or 3, and then it turns out later that they might have had some other issues, but it doesn't turn out to be autism or Asperger's. Just like it's hard to predict the future of any 2 or 3-year-old, it's very hard it's impossible to know exactly the course of the development of a child at 2 or 3. Even if they meet the criteria for autism at that age. Over time, though, it does become a stable diagnosis. So it's if someone by 6, 7, 8 firmly meets the criteria for a diagnosis of autism, they're probably going to meet that diagnosis, meet the criteria for the diagnosis over the rest of their lives, which doesn't at all mean they won't grow and develop and change in many ways, but they'll probably still have social interaction, communication difficulties that we talked about. Okay, does the diagnosis matter? Is there really any such thing? I mean, at some level, it's important to remember that we've made up these diagnoses on groups of people having similar characteristics. So there really isn't a thing that is autism or Asperger's, but it's a set of challenges that people share in common. And it can be very helpful in terms of a shortcut for, oh, he has autism. Okay, now I get it. It can be a shortcut for why somebody's acting a certain way or interacting a certain way. It can help explain things. Oh, it's not his fault. It's not your fault as a parent. Now I understand. And the more autism is in the media, the more we have forums like this, I think there is increasing understanding. I was talking to one parent, and it's not the first parent I've heard say, I wish my child had a T-shirt saying I had autism so people would understand right away, because particularly if someone's quite verbal and looks fine, it might be very, very confusing. You're in the food store with your 4 children and one of them is having a meltdown and you can't do anything about it. If they had the T-shirt, people wouldn't give you looks or call the SS or whatever. So it could be very helpful. But it's a shortcut for needs. It's also a shortcut for treatment. You don't have to reinvent the wheel in terms of what treatments, because we know there are a lot of educational treatments and therapeutic treatments that can be extremely helpful. So we don't have to, again, start from scratch. It can also be very helpful for people, especially people with Asperger's, to find other people with Asperger's. And just like there's somewhat of a deaf pride movement, there's somewhat of an Asperger's pride movement as well. And the Asperger's Association of New England and the Northeast Arc have done a lot to really promote a sense of identity in terms of that this could be a positive thing as well. I'm just going to show a quick little clip of Adam with Asperger's because he explains it so well. And this is a little clip from YouTube. And he describes very much what he's very aware of Asperger's and how it impacts him. And he describes it with a sense of humor. He has his own YouTube channel, and he makes a lot of videos that he calls Adam Funny. But he said this one is different. He's not going to do Adam Funny. He's going to tell you about his diagnosis.
Hey, it's Adam, and today I'm not going to be doing as funny as an episode of Adam Funny today. Well, you see, what I'm going to talk about today is about my disorder known as Asperger's syndrome. Yeah, I have it. I just never told you ever, till now. You see, a lot of kids with Asperger's, including me, have trouble with conversations, and man, I have trouble with that. Let's say some friends at school are talking about some TV show like The Simpsons, and I'm like, hey guys, have you heard of the new video game Zatch Bell Moto Fury? Oh yeah, it is so hacking awesome. There's 2 playable characters? Yeah! And it's rated T for teen. So I dare you to get blah, 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 and blah, 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 blah. That's what I have trouble with. Yeah, it also happens in class, like sometimes when the teacher is talking about something like in science, like erosions, I might say, hey, I've heard of that on one episode of SpongeBob. And yeah. And a lot of kids might have trouble with changes. Yeah. You see, when I had to go to the post office one day when it was like a free afternoon, I didn't expect it and I got so peeved off and I threw a temper tantrum. Yeah, like this. I don't want to go to the post office! Oh my god! Yeah. And another thing I have problems with is swimming class in school. You see, swimming class is really hard. I have trouble with swim. It might have to do something with my Asperger's and gross motor skills. You see, swimming is hard for me. Well, I did learn how to do this on my belly, but I'm still working on floating on my back. And the problem is I'm afraid of doing that stuff, and I'm upset because I don't know when it's coming. I don't like to be surprised, like most Asperger kids. Yeah. Okay. And also, this is kind of off topic. Oh man, that's an Asperger symptom, but I don't care. The Pittsburgh went to the Super Bowl. Woo! It's a miracle. Wait, no, that's not a miracle. This is a miracle. Want to see a miracle? Well, here you go. Here I go. Here I go. Oh, man. Oh, dear God. Okay, bye.
I think he captures it well, and he's really aware of what he struggles with, and yet he's a very joyful child who clearly is entertaining to himself and others, too. I'm just quickly going to say a few more words and then wrap up. There's something people call the cascading deficit model for autism. If you're off socially from the beginning and off with communication, so much of learning happens through social interaction and communication, both teaching at school, social learning with friends, learning from your parents and your siblings. And that's the importance of early intervention and early schooling, really meeting the needs and really bolstering up kids' social interaction and communication skills so they can function and learn effectively, so they don't have the cascading deficit effect. As you may have gathered so far from the clips and from what I've said, a lot of other issues can go along with autism or Asperger's, including anxiety, mood dysregulation, mood disorder, attention difficulties, obsessive issues, and for many young adults, social isolation can then lead to depression for kids and young adults. So that's sort of a secondary problem that can happen. Okay, so the most useful strategy in terms of treating or working with or living with someone with autism is to get to know that person as a unique person first. Their likes and dislikes, their sense of humor, what their special interests are, even if it's obscure, to get to know something about that. And to make sure to not take their quirks and differences and social gaffes, not to take those personally and to just recognize that that's part of the disorder and the syndrome. And then as a culture, can we embrace the social differences without personalizing these, foster systems of social support and emotional support, and provide supports and community for families, as Nicole was talking about. Can we help individuals channel their unique strengths? Can we find the balance of helping individuals develop skills to live more easily and successfully in our culture while celebrating their strengths and challenges and differences? Thank you.
I just had a quick question on the first video. I saw a child where he was rocking back and forth. And I was wondering, is that to obtain some kind of comfort? I wasn't sure what that was about.
Probably. Rocking is pretty common, again, across the spectrum, people with Asperger's as well as people with autism. It's also fairly common in individuals with other sorts of neurological disorders, too. Oftentimes, people with autism who can tell us about it will say it's calming for them or it's soothing for them. And it's somewhat for anybody. If you think about a rocking chair, it's probably soothing. It's probably related to some of the sensory issues and sensory overload.
Our next speaker will be Wayne Burton. President Burton is a former New Hampshire state representative and has held positions in higher ed administration at the University of New Hampshire and Salem State University prior to taking the presidency at North Shore in 2000. He has worked tirelessly in providing leadership and vision not only at North Shore Community College, but as a board member to community and business programs. President Burton has also spent his time on many statewide and national committees advocating for students. He is the only community college representative serving on the Massachusetts Economic and Workforce Development, U.S. Department of Higher Education Committee on Measures of Student Success. This year, President Burton was appointed chair of the National Community College Consortium on Autism and Intellectual Disabilities. This committee develops programs, secures funding, and supports initiatives to help individuals with autism lead productive lives, including entering the workforce. It is now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Wayne Burton.
Good morning, and people who are participating, don't worry if waves of people come in and leave. Those are students coming to class and leaving, so they're not insulting anybody. They're just going where they're supposed to go. But I hope the core here will stay. In 1985, I was appointed to co-chair a committee to rewrite the special ed laws in New Hampshire because New Hampshire had voted them out. As you may know, the U.S. Constitution delegates education to the states, and if the states don't want to participate, they don't have to. For a year, I spent rewriting that law, doing all the attributes of IEPs. My specialty were kids appointed in the court system, for example, and who writes their IEPs. What do you do with disputed IEPs and that sort of thing? But through it all, I met hundreds of people who had or knew of children with disabilities and became an advocate. It's hard not to. About 3 years ago, Congressman Tierney asked me on behalf of Senator Kennedy to lead an effort nationally to put programs in place at colleges because 94-142 had brought students through secondary school systems, and many successfully. It worked. But when they came to post-secondary, they hit a wall, but not here at North Shore. And they asked me to work on the legislation, which, thanks to Senator Kennedy, was enacted and funded. And we had 27 programs running across the country, but we just scratched the surface. We need a special ed for higher ed policy, law, or strategy. We have none in this country right now. I've met with the Undersecretary of Education on this in Washington 3 times this year for that. There are 700,000 students in higher education institutions in this country with disabilities. Half of them are at public community colleges because we welcome them. They should be here. But when they get here, we don't have the support in place that they have come to be so helpful that they get in the secondary school system. That's the challenge we have. Fortunately, we have an incredible leader in Massachusetts, in Barbara L'Italian, who's here today. Barbara is right now the Director of Government Relations for the Massachusetts Treasury Department. Barbara has vigorously advocated for the rights of individuals with autism throughout her career in public service. Representing the 18th District, I believe, she did so well from 03 to 210. She spearheaded legislation on behalf of those with autism. Barbara has led initiatives on behalf of the elderly in Massachusetts, such as securing funding for the Massachusetts Prescription Advantage Program. During 2009-2010, she served as vice chair of House Committee on Ways and Means, assisting in the creation of the state budget. And more pertinent to today's program, she was instrumental in establishing the Massachusetts Commission on Autism and currently chairs the commission on which I serve at the appointment of Governor Patrick. She is a woman of great courage, not just because she is the leader of the autism advocacy in this state, but she leads a commission with 33 very independent, very strong people asserting themselves at every meeting, and she's trying to pull this all together, and for that she deserves great credit. And it's my great pleasure now to introduce Barbara to speak. It's our honor to have her here this morning.
Well, I am not a prepared speech giver. I'm more of a conversationalist, so I'm going to have a conversation with you for the next few minutes. I think to start with is the fact that looking at Adam in that video, if you remember the young man that jumped off the top of the bunk and, there was lots of laughter at sort of the humorous part of it. There were a lot of very pregnant pauses that got me in my throat, because looking at Adam, I would say, would be looking at my son, Rudy, when he was about that same age. Rudy's now 21 years old. Rudy is a student at the North Shore Community College campus in Danvers. In fact, I dropped him off this morning because he does not drive. Dropped him off at Danvers first and then made my way over here. He didn't want to come. I know his teachers had said, Rudy, if you want to come over and participate in the day, that would be okay. But Rudy still very much dwells in a land of black and white and felt that he did not want to miss his classes. And I guess he saw the Temple Grandin movie in one of his classes, and so it was sort of funny. He had a reporter with him from WBUR who was going to do a segment, has yet to be done, about transition for people on the spectrum to community college and to other options. And she was with him the day that they watched the Temple Grandin film. And I think he was very nonplussed about the film because he was like, hey, I'm living it. I mean, I don't need to learn about this stuff. I'm living it. So anyways, if you can picture in your mind Adam, that was pretty much my son at age 5. I had been a social worker, so I was a trained advocate, but it was within the realm of working with the elderly. Rudy was my oldest. I have 4. And Rudy was one of these kids that if things weren't going well for him, the whole world knew about it. In class, he would get up, he'd run around the room, he'd disrupt the class, throw it into utter chaos. School didn't know what to do with him. At age 8, they were saying to us, you can put him somewhere, anywhere, okay? But we can't keep him here in the public school system. And that was a struggle. So my first role as advocate was as mom to understand the diagnosis. He was diagnosed at age 5, actually at the Salem Children's Hospital, North Shore Children's Hospital, I think it's called. Diagnosed there with Asperger's. And so my first task was to find out everything I could, get to know about, because obviously when you're presented with an issue, you want to understand it. And at that time, the Autism Support Center was being run, and still is, by the Northeast ARC, and that became my first place to go to find out information about what this was all about. It was very liberating to have a diagnosis, to look in that DSM-4 and find out that all those things that you thought were just your quirky kid spring off the page to you. It was very liberating, I think, for our family, because we didn't understand. And I did have the kid that would have meltdowns in the movie theater, and people would yell, get that kid out of here. I mean, it was tough. I was, the mom who had the kid who, at the end of the year in kindergarten, people were saying, not knowing I was his mother, oh, I'm so glad to be done this school year and rid of that kid. He was such a disruption. He shouldn't have been in that class. He took away from my kid's perfect experience. So we had a really rough go when he was a young boy. There were no options for school for him. We actually had to work with his neuropsychologist and his psychiatrist to help create a school on the grounds of McLean Hospital. The outpatient child psychiatry unit agreed to donate some space. I remember my husband and I painting walls, giving them some furniture and computers and things from a small business that we had. And that became the first of a school for kids with Asperger's in the country. He subsequently moved on to a different school setting as well. But so I had started as an advocate. I also, when we found out he had Asperger's, through the North Shore, Autism Support Center, heard there was a group of people gathering in Newton to, work on Asperger's, work on what could be done because they were not being served. There were no resources, and we were really on we were on a new frontier. And that group that met at the Wellesley Weston Housing Agency became the beginnings of the Asperger's Association of New England. So I was one of the founding board members of that group. And that group was very much a grassroots movement that I can remember in the early days we were holding events such as this, asking experts in the field to come in and speak at no cost, charging a little entrance fee to begin to start to fund something. And they are now 15 years strong and doing very, very well. So I started as an advocate, first and foremost as a parent, going to bat at IEP meetings, going to bat to make sure that my child was going to have the best possible outcome. And I think that's what every parent wants, regardless of where their child is on the spectrum. They want their child to have the best possible outcome. I think Karen Levine mentioned, and Karen, by the way, serves on our Autism Commission as well. I think Karen mentioned that it's very difficult sometimes because if you're in a wheelchair, if you're blind, if you're deaf, it's pretty obvious to people. This is much more of a hidden disability. And so when someone looks like they're typical and then has some sort of event that causes them to act out, have a meltdown, say something that might be seen as outrageous, it's really tough because people don't know. So they really don't cut you that slack. My son's name is Rudy because of my father's, named after my dad who had passed on right before he was born. But kids in school thought his name was Rudy because he was rude. So that became the tagline, Rudy is rude, when he was a little boy. I entered the legislature in 2003. Decided to do that because I figured I'd been an advocate for many, many years. Had never run for office before, but thought, if you can advocate for your kid, and we had a lot of knockdown dragouts over education plans, trying to find a school, keeping that school viable. I figured that I could go in and play some part. I thought I wasn't a lawyer, I was just a mom, but I thought I knew some places in state government where it wasn't working. And I thought I could go in and perhaps influence some of that debate. One of the things that I had been doing as a member of Asperger's Association New England was working to try to find a home for folks on the spectrum who were not being served. There was no real place for people with autism. Clearly there were folks that were lower functioning that were getting some services under what was then called Department of Mental Retardation, now Department of Developmental Services. But by and large, there wasn't really a home for people. So within a month of landing in office in 2003, I actually called up the heads of the different commissioners. So the commissioner of DMR, Jerry Morrissey, the commissioner of mental health, commissioner of public health, and asked if they would come in my office and have a conversation about the fact that there really wasn't a home for people with autism. They all agreed. They all agreed it had been an underserved population. They all agreed that this is a group that had waited for a very, very long time, had not really complained, and were more than deserving of something. So that became the beginnings of conversations that culminated in 2005 in setting up a division on autism. And that division on autism serves through the different autism support centers scattered throughout the state. We have the one here in Danvers that would serve this catchment area. And so the idea was that there were these autism support centers that I believe all the different ARCs had risen up out of necessity. Oftentimes the grassroots are way ahead of government. They're way ahead because they're responding in the here and now to the needs. So the Autism Division serves folks up to age 18 because that's what Jerry Morrissey was willing to take. And so it doesn't serve, adults and young adults. And by and large, at the moment, it serves folks who are at the lower end of the functioning scale, which is absolutely needed. As I continued on my advocacy push as a legislator, I worked very closely. I don't know if Julia Landau is here yet or not, but she'll be one of your panel speakers later on. Julia serves on our commission. Julia works for Mass Advocates for Children. And she's on the ground with all of the folks who are hitting the wall with education. Oftentimes when they get to her, there are lawsuits involved or going to hearing. There are often big tugs of war over people being able to get the educational services that they needed. So Julia and I worked together on trying to get an autism federal Medicaid waiver passed. So that's something where you file an application down to Maryland and the federal government agrees to pay for a waiver. It's limited in number. So our waiver to start out served only 70 children. But for those children, it was a game changer. It gave them the opportunity to receive what are called wraparound services. So we know that people get services to a greater or lesser degree during the school day, but what happens to them when they go home? Oftentimes, there's nothing. There are no support systems. People desperately need to have help with behavior therapy, with social and emotional. Again, back to Adam, I just remember when my son was little, we'd bring him to the YMCA and in swimming lessons, and they'd kick him out of the pool every day. He'd sit on the timeout bench because he couldn't attend long enough. So oftentimes, we need to really educate people within the recreation world for those hours after school so that our kids can have a chance to have those sorts of experiences as well. So this federal Medicaid waiver was passed. It enabled, as I said, about 70 kids to start. We put out word on this just through the Autism Support Centers during the month of November. So think of how crazy it is, Thanksgiving and Christmas. And I believe we had over 2,000 families come forward asking to meet one of those slots for 70 slots. There's a tremendous need out there. So that program has started. We have grown that a bit over the years. The idea is if you can get more money in at the state side in the budget, the feds will match it. They provide a 50% match. And the idea is to try and slowly grow that program over time. We allow kids to stay in that program for a finite set of years. The reason being that then you're creating a new slot. You're opening it up to someone else because we're trying to get to kids early. I think Karen probably mentioned this, that the ideal situation is to get to kids early, bombard them with the assistance that they need, and to produce, the best possible outcome. So that federal Medicaid waiver, started and is still in existence, and it's an ongoing, because one of the things I'm supposed to be telling you is advocacy is ongoing. The need is ongoing. We need to be vigilant. We also did something with IEPs. Those of you who are parents know that IEP is your individualized education plan. And there were many, many situations coming in where students who might do very well academically, but just are totally falling apart socially, emotionally, all the other aspects that make up the whole person and make them a happy student, were not necessarily being addressed. So if you get a kid who's doing very well academically, there were schools refusing to put them on an ed plan, refusing to offer the supports for the rest of the day. Best example I can give you, when my son was little in the public school system, he was reading 4 grade levels above his peers, and yet would have a meltdown every single day in the unstructured parts of the day. He was goaded into dropping his pants on the bus. That was an unstructured place. He was having meltdowns in gym, in recess, out on the playground, in the lunchroom. All those places are places where there's a lot going on. And it can be too much to take in. It can be incredibly overwhelming. And those are areas that need just as much vigilance, just as much supervision and help as the academics. So anyways, we tweaked the IEP laws to make sure that not just academics are factored in, that people that are doing okay academically can still get some assistance for the other parts of their life. Likewise, I referred to Rudy being bullied when he was a little boy. He was a kindergartner. He was bullied by an 8th grader on the bus. We put into the bullying legislation that passed last year that many people have heard about a recognition that folks on the autism spectrum really need their entire team to buy in and help them advocate so that they're not victims. When Julia speaks later, she may mention the stats. I don't have the exact figures in my head, but the stats on bullying for kids on the autism spectrum are off the charts. And it's because people present differently. They may have a different affect in terms of their voice. They may have physical, you saw the boy rocking, when my son was little, this is what he would do. He would shake his hand. He did it when he was happy, but it was also for neurological overflow. If he was just, way up there, he would flap his hands. Eventually, we did a really good job of working with the schools to understand that meant Rudy was happy. It wasn't a threatening thing. But anyway, so kids are easy targets for bullying. So we put into legislation making sure that the entire team helps this kid. You can't expect this kid to necessarily negotiate this on their own. If they could, they wouldn't be a subject of bullying. So we did that over the years. Recently, we passed a bill to put in place an autism commission. That was signed last April by the governor. And it is a very large, as Wayne said, a very large and unwieldy commission. It's messy business doing politics and doing governance, but I wouldn't have it any other way because, as I alluded to, right now we have some people that are getting services, and even within that you could have a debate on whether or not those services are adequate, but we have large groups of people on the spectrum that get nothing at all. Right now, if you are above a 70 IQ, you are not looked at, considered at all by developmental services. So you may test and have, real challenges in some of your tests, but if you scatter and go over 70 and even one subtest, then you're denied service. And so when I was a legislator, I would hear from people all over the state that were really frustrated because their child was not going to get any services and it was essentially going to be on them. So this commission is for... Keep talking. Okay. So it's for the entire spectrum. Okay. And Karen talked about the range from, nonverbal folks all the way up to hyperverbal people. Okay. So it's the entire range from what I would call sort of classic Connors autism up to Asperger's high functioning autism. So it's the whole range. And it's of all ages. Because again, while it was a victory to get the division on autism, it cuts off at 18. What do we do with everybody else? Okay. So we have had all sorts of tussles. We've been meeting for about a year now. We are in the phase of drafting our recommendations. We hope to be done by the end of January. But we've had all sorts of tussles around groups wanting to be sure that they and their interest is taken care of. And it's understandable because what you think is the highest priority is whatever you're living right now. My job is to make sure that we represent the needs of the entire spectrum. So it's been a long and laborious process. We also, over the last year, passed into law the need to broaden teaching within the public higher ed system on augmentative communication, and also, within teacher training, kids that are currently attending college, to try to be sure that those who are being trained to be teachers are going to have at least a working knowledge of what augmentative communication is. So for those of you who don't know, augmentative communication can range from a very simple little chart with pictures on it, where someone could point to, I'm hungry, I'm tired, I don't feel well, I've got to go to the bathroom, I need a drink, to very fancy iPods and other devices that can essentially set up a whole conversation with you. What we were finding through, again, I worked so closely with mass advocates, was feedback from families that their child needed a device. Schools, they get placed into a classroom in a public school system. Teacher, well-intentioned, wants to help, but doesn't know what to do, doesn't know how to work with this. We felt like that's really wrong because there's so many people on the autism spectrum that are nonverbal. And if we can get people to have this as part of their core training when they're studying to be teachers or when they're going back for recertification, that opens up a whole new world for people to be able to communicate. So that was passed last year legislatively. Probably most importantly, in addition to the Autism Commission, because we'll be doing our short, medium, and long-range planning and providing sort of a blueprint for what can be done legislatively with law, with the budget, what can be done by the philanthropic community, what can be done by the general public. So in addition to the Autism Commission work that we're doing, last year we passed an autism medical insurance bill. We actually have the strongest legislation in the entire country. That was passed last July. It took effect January of this year. So up to that point, medical insurers did not have to cover essential services for folks on the autism spectrum. They did not have to cover the testing involved. They did not have to cover speech and language. They did not have to cover behavioral assistance. And so working in conjunction with a number of different groups in Massachusetts, the Doug Flutie Foundation, AFAM, which is the umbrella organization for the whole state of all these little groups that had sort of creeped up in advocacy and no one knew what the other was doing, so they wisely sort of pulled them all together under the banner of AFAM. And then Autism Speaks as well. So we worked together and were able to get this bill passed in record time, in under 2 years. When you're talking about broadening a medical insurance mandate, sometimes that can take 10 years. Sometimes it never happens. There are still people that don't have coverage for hearing aids. There are still people that don't have coverage for dental if they have a particular medical condition where they're born without teeth. So it's pretty astounding that we were able to pull together and get this thing passed in under 2 years. The way we did it, and it harkens back to advocacy in general, was we engaged the grassroots. So we had parents calling each of their individual legislators, sharing their story, explaining why this would be important to them, oftentimes explaining where people had to second mortgage their homes to pay for the services that their kids needed. So we had at the grassroots level people contacting and having a conversation with their legislator, be it in person, at office hours, on the phone, by email, however they did it, coming into the building. So we had sort of the grassroots layer. We had sort of the big advocacy push at the top. My co-sponsor of this was Fred Berry, Senator Fred Berry, who's one of my favorite people in the whole wide world, who helped on the Senate side. We had the former Senate President Bob Travellini helping us to do this. It was like a dream team of people that wanted to pull together and get this done. But I will also say that over the 8 years that I was a legislator, I made sure that I spoke to every single legislator in that building. I told them about my son. I brought my son in because he was comfortable with that. You have to be, considerate of what your child's comfort level is. He came in and met with people. We brought in people from his school. So there was a lot of groundwork done. There was a lot of educating. We brought in experts to sort of do teach-ins on autism at the State House. There were many, many years of groundwork laid to get all of this done. Bob DeLeo, who's the current Speaker of the House, had met with my son privately. After we got the division started, he sort of understood the lower end of the spectrum but couldn't get Asperger's and high functioning. So I brought Rudy in and sort of unleashed him on the speaker for an hour, and he saw the good, the bad, and the ugly that is my son. So that helped a lot, though, because then you can it's with understanding, right? Understanding and awareness comes tolerance, comes acceptance, comes the ability to recognize a problem and do something about it. So that autism medical insurance bill became effective January 1st. I see it as a potential game changer, particularly for young children who might need applied behavior analysis, might need some of the other floor time and some of the other options that are available to young children so that they can get what they need as early as possible so that they can be on the best possible path. Okay, we're almost done. Just one other thing. in terms of ongoing vigilance, one of the biggest challenges is, and we hope to address this in our commission, finding a single home for everyone on the autism spectrum that might be within developmental services, might be within mass rehab. We've got to figure that out. We need to figure out what happens to people after they matriculate out at age 22, what sort of opportunities there are, be it vocational, educational, job opportunities. Wayne's doing a lot of that, and interestingly enough, my son graduated from high school at 21, but already had 5 courses at North Shore under his belt because Wayne was willing to have his class of students who were all in that same boat. They were over 18. They weren't done with their high school curriculum, but they were sort of ready to do the next step. They were able to come over and do a course per semester. So my son already had 5 courses under his belt by the time he had graduated from high school. That's sometimes done under what's called concurrent enrollment, sometimes under dual enrollment. So we need to figure out ways to sort of make a pathway for people beyond age 22. We need housing, we need jobs, we need a support system. And so even though, unfortunately, a year ago yesterday, I lost my seat in the legislature, the fight goes on. And we still need to be vigilant. There's so much more that we need to do. When we do put out the Autism Commission report, I would urge all of you who are interested in it to go on mass.gov and read it. It will have recommendations. We will be realistic in terms of the timelines of when we think things can happen. Because I think if you go and state a laundry list of problems and don't attach actionable items in a time frame, people just get overwhelmed and tune out. So we're going to try to be as realistic as possible with that. Just the fight goes on. There's so much more that we need to do. I continue to serve a very active role. I'm fortunate that Steve Grossman, my boss, let me do things like this, chair the Autism Commission, and because I'm still in the State House, people still stick their head in the door and say, what should we do about? So I can still very much be an advocate, even though I'm not a legislator. So I guess we're done. Thank you.
Thank you. Don't go. First, I just want to say there's nothing bad or ugly about Rudy Battagliano. I learned my greatest lesson, I think, from Rudy. I think it was a conversation with him that I referred to him as an autistic person. He quickly corrected me. I'm a person with autism. And if you remember nothing else from this morning, it's very, very important. I stole the mic over here. Professor Mott's over there. Any questions for Barbara?
Good morning. Good morning. Hi, I'm a teacher, a special education teacher in the state of Massachusetts, a public school. And I find that I'm so glad to hear that we're advocating for students on the spectrum of autism. And I'm very glad to hear that teachers who are going through programs today should be or must be trained in autism. As a special education teacher, I happen to have chosen to come here today with my sister who does have a child with autism or on the spectrum. I strongly feel as a public school educator that we educators must not only be trained, more trained in how to meet the needs of children with autism. However, my concern is identifying those students. When I attend IEP meetings, it's only when, with the team, in our case, in our public school, it's only when we are fortunate enough that the parents let us know that their child has been identified as being on the autistic spectrum, that we can talk about meeting his or her needs. So I would say as an educator for many years, I'm seeing more and more that we're encountering the need as educators to meet the needs of these lovely, beautiful children. And I strongly advocate that educators work with parents in identifying to the educator, to the school, and putting it right out there so that we can let the parents know, and we as educators can share the information with other educators in the classroom who may not know what we can do to get these children into programs, educational programs, so that they can become very excellent citizens in contributing to society.
I think the issue around disclosure could be a whole day seminar. When to disclose, what to disclose, whether or not you disclose. It's a very personal thing. I will say that it is the case. It's obviously the family's choice. I think that sometimes people don't disclose if they feel that academically their kids are doing okay. They don't necessarily disclose. But in order to receive services with an IEP, you need a diagnosable condition. So most people do end up having a diagnosis of autism or PDD or Asperger's. Again, I think that the biggest thing is trying to get it early. The challenge as a policymaker is working, quite frankly, with the education commissioners, because there's a threshold at which they will take input on how much they're willing to change their curriculum for teachers that are brand new learning, and those that are going back to meet their certification requirements. And there's always an initial reaction of, we don't want to put any more on people, but that can't be the answer, because there's such a wave of kids with autism that there's no denying it. There's a need for it. I was able to walk in one day to my youngest son's elementary school for a Halloween concert, and the kids were expected to sit on the floor and attend for an hour to a concert. And I could just sit there as a layperson and point out 6 kids that were on the spectrum whose needs were not being met. Again, I think the teachers are interested in helping. They're there to help. They want to help. Our challenge is, how do we give them the training, the supervision, sometimes the outside expertise, because no way can we ever afford, nor would we want to have every kid go out of district. For a couple of years before the budget was cut, we had monies that we were trying to ideally work up to cover the entire state, where centers of excellence could come in and do trainings to public school teachers with a goal towards leaving kids in the district if we can. Now, my son, as I said, left at age 8, very socially isolating to get on a van and go to, half an hour away from your home. And so there are a lot of good reasons to be in your district, provided you're getting the services that you need. So we had money from Melmark to go in and do consultations. Mass Advocates goes in and does consultations. We're trying to build it up so May Institute, New England Center, we're trying to dot the whole landscape and have monies available to go in and do consultations to school systems. Because if you don't do that and wait for a child to fail, the consequences can be very deep for that child. So I agree that there should be more cross-training. I think that special ed training floats all boats. I think it helps everybody. So I think that we need to do more of that. But the challenge as a policymaker is pushing the envelope with the educational powers that be to allow that to happen. And interestingly enough, in terms of advocacy, so I have 4 children, right? Rudy's my oldest. He's doing his thing at North Shore. My next oldest is going to be a neurologist. So she's decided the impact on her brother, of growing up with him 2 years younger is so great that she's at MIT studying brain science. And my senior in high school is going to be a special ed education major next year. So there's an impact on families. Families become built-in advocates. And so there's this place called the Judge Rotenberg Center. It's in Canton, Mass. It used to be called the Behavioral Research Institute. It was located in Rhode Island. There were a number of deaths, and Rhode Island basically shut them down and kicked them out of the state. They came up to Massachusetts. They use what's called aversive therapy. And aversive therapy can be a whole range of things to try and control behavior, ranging from putting sour or lemon juice on your tongue, spicy things on your tongue, all the way up to what they do, which is they do skin shocks. It's been going on for decades. There are people that have been there for 30 years that have never been exposed to any other sort of positive behavioral approaches. There are people that have actually been taken out of there and put in places like Melmark, where they've actually been able to turn things around. There was an incident a couple of years, so I had a bill to make it illegal altogether to do aversive therapy. There was also a bill we were trying to do, which would be a middle ground, which would provide further controls on the use of aversive therapy, have it be for time limited, and really step up the court supervision of this. Because the other bill hadn't passed, quite frankly, in 30 years. And so when something's not happening, you've got to come and try and do what's possible and try and at least begin to address the issue. So the good news on that is that the Judge Rotenberg Center now, the DDS is actually stepping up their efforts to really control them through regulation. For many, many years, they've been very afraid to do that. Judge Rotenberg is a very litigious group. They're very well funded. It costs $250,000 per student to go in there. They've got a lot of money, and they would sue anyone who would try to do anything against them. I was told I'd have a lien on my home for trying to do, sort of shut them down or contain them. But DDS now, to their credit, did a series of regulatory hearings a couple of months ago, and they're looking to rein them in. They were afraid to, quite frankly, because a commissioner actually lost his job over trying to get this place closed down. So it remains a concern. But I feel like we're moving in the right direction with that. Because I agree with you, no kid should be subject to what we would call cruel and unusual punishment if we were to do this in any prison. And the really perplexing thing is they've been doing this for decades on some kids. And on some kids that are coming in, who you could explain why their behavior was not correct and try to help them and shape changes, they just shock them and they're not allowed to point out and make changes to explain to them where they went wrong. It's just if you do something wrong, you get shocked immediately. It sounds outrageous, but that's what's going on.
SB.
Hello, my name is Esperanza from Salem and Inland. I would like, first of all, to agree with the educator from the public school system. I am aware that in Lynn we have a large population of ELL and ESL students in the public schools, and the educators are not allowed, even though they're well-trained, they can suspect a disability, they can suspect autism within the spectrum, but they may not inform the parent about it. And if there is an IEP, they don't have it. Only the counselors have it. And many times, there are now interpreters. How do the students and the parents find out how to get tested if they're not advised by the school? It seems like nobody can advise them, and unless they're already in special education and they have an IEP. But sometimes it takes a parent to find out and be savvy enough to get an interpreter to demand the services, but most often they don't. What is your knowledge about the services being provided ELL and ESL parents and students with disabilities and autism?
I can tell you that we've recognized this as a real shortcoming, and it will be addressed in our Autism Commission. We know that we need to provide more outreach for cultural and linguistic folks with those challenges. I know that Mass Advocates for Children goes out and goes into some communities. I know they're in Lawrence, I believe, working with, I would assume, primarily Hispanic families, but maybe they're shaking their heads yes. So I know that Mass Advocates is going out and going into some communities where there's a high need for families to be educated. There's also the different special ed advocacy groups will come out and run programming on just basic special ed rights and what your IEP rights and all of that are. But we know that this is a real shortcoming. I know within Boston there's a very strong Haitian community that has arisen out of necessity. And that's what happens. People become motivated by necessity. There's nothing there, so they create it. But we know that there are cultural and linguistic centers, multicultural centers that are around the state that DDS operates. We don't feel there's enough of a linkage and enough of making that overture to families to reach them in their language and then educate them about the spectrum. We know that. We know there are some real horror stories out there.
I want to say that the Children's Law Center here in Lynn provides a lot of services to all parents, especially to Latino and other ethnic group parents. However, on a legislative level, what do you think will happen in terms of, does that have to be done at a local level to change the school committee, to change the school administration, or do you do it at the state level? I have to find out where to start.
I think ideally you start at both ends and try to race to the middle. I think that, when we find a trend that's troubling, it's always good to start by educating at the local level, but also, coming in and maybe doing an in-service in the State House to educate the lawmakers about it, maybe talking to the Education Committee towards an end of figuring out if there is a legislative fix. I will say, though, for everyone that laws can be passed, but if they're not enforced, that's a challenge. And I do understand the great budgetary constraints that the public school systems are in. And I do understand that their special ed, I guess another thing we used to fight for was special ed funding through the circuit breaker, because I feel like that's something everyone can agree on. Parents and administrators and teachers can all agree they need more special ed funding. We may disagree on how it gets parceled out. But I have a next door neighbor who teaches deaf-blind, and in a local school system, and I know she's under tremendous pressure not to reach out to the parents, not to tell them what their rights are. It's very concerning. But I think advocacy has to happen at the grassroots level by going to the school committee, mentioning it, saying it's a problem, and at the same time a parallel track with trying to do something at the top.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I have great sympathy to some. When I was doing legislation, I'm sure Barbara too, that when you have hearings, pretty soon you see the room is full of lawyers and people from the school districts, and I would call the parents advocates. Said, you better get some advocates over here now, because no one speaks for the kids except you folks and Barbara and others. Before we close this section, I'm going to put a couple of people on the spot, because Dave Hull's about to announce a break. Dave, that's your role, I think, and I'm going to get you up here. But we have some incredible staff at the college. Susan Graham, our Director of Disabilities, is in the back. Lucy Baird standing next to her. Dean Ellen O'Donnell of Human Services, an incredible advocate in her area where all our programs are. We train people in this field. Dean Ellen, Maureen O'Neill is here, I know, from liberal arts. So at the break, if you're going to stand there, Susan, you're going to get a lot of questions. I hope. She is an incredible advocate herself. I can't thank you enough for coming today and your work. It's really amazing. I think I have. Now, this underneath here, it's not the box of Kleenex. I know that. Okay, here we go. On behalf of the college, for all your time and coming here today, we have this token of appreciation. I look forward to my conversations with Rudy. By the way, Rudy, I think, is carrying a 4.0, something like that. And we had a conversation because he was in high school. He took our honors English. Wasn't that right? He wanted to do it, and he did extremely well. He's a very, very bright young man, and we're very proud that he's here. With that, I want to thank Barbara once again for being here.